Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Randwick City Library Live and Online. My name is Georgina, the Local Studies Librarian at Randwick City Library, and it gives me great pleasure to host our author talk this evening. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Randwick City Library stands, the Gadigal and the Bidjigal peoples who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. On behalf of Randwick City Council, I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending online today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. This includes my respect for the elders wherever each of us is located today. In addition, this evening, I particularly wish to acknowledge the members of the Wiradjuri Nation and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of their land. Tonight, it is our pleasure and our delight to welcome Dr. Anita Heiss, who is a proud member of the Wiradjuri Nation of Central New South Wales, but was also born in Gadigal country and has spent much of her life on land at La Perouse. She is one of Australia's most prolific authors, writing across genres including non-fiction, historical fiction, commercial fiction and children's books. She is no stranger to the Lionel Bowen Library, having crafted some of her early manuscripts in our study room number 1. I will let you tell her the nickname she has for this bold hold. Anita is currently a professor of communications at the University of Queensland and is a lifetime ambassador for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Anita comes to us tonight on the back of promoting Indigenous Literacy Day last week to help us celebrate History Week this week. The theme this year of History Week is From the Ground Up. Of the numerous glowing reviews of Anita's latest work, of the timeless heroine, Wiradjuri, this really captures it for me about how I feel about Anita's book. I feel it's the book all Australians should read, to try and understand why our colonial past still causes so much pain and grievance. Anita will be discussing her latest book, Bila Yarrudhanggalangdhuray, or The River of Dreams. Good evening, Anita. How are you this evening?
Marangiria, good evening, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. And your language for the title was spot on, Georgina.
I've tried and tried, but we've had a few dramas, so I think I could do better. And I'm proud that I've downloaded the app, so I'm going to be practicing.
If I may, I'd just like to, it's wonderful to see so many people have joined us this evening. So I'd like to say to everybody from up here in Brisbane, Marangiria, Yuandu Anita Heiss, Baladu Wiradjuri Geelong, Arambajibu Brungleybu Megandi Bala Williams, Yinamaladu, Bulga Galangbu, Balagir Bangbu, Balambumbu Wiradjuri, Nurembangbu, Yinjimaradu, Yagaragu, Turubugu, Mianjingu, Maingu. So what I tried to, I hope I said fluently, if there's fluent speakers online, please be kind. I know there's a Q&A box that you can put comments in, but what I said in my Wiradjuri language, which I've only been learning for a very short period of time, is good evening. My name is Anita Heiss and I have Wiradjuri belonging from Arambi and Brungle missions, and they're both in central New South Wales. I'm a Williams. I have respect for my elders, for those who have passed over, my ancestors and Wiradjuri country. But tonight I'm zooming in, thanks to technology, zooming in from Mianjin, which is the traditional name for Brisbane. And I pay my respects to the traditional owners here and the current caretakers of country in Yagara and Turrbal land. And I always like to acknowledge First Peoples, or anywhere I am, as the first storytellers of the place, because what we're doing tonight is sharing stories, and everywhere we walk in Australia, there are original storytellers. So thank you also for everybody joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for that great welcome to country, and please be gentle with me because I'm an infant in the language, so I am trying. And as I said, I have downloaded, downloaded the app. So what a powerful novel this is, Anita. Truly it is humbling to have you here this evening. I spent the weekend finishing the book, and I think it will take a long time for me to digest the story and all its implications and its how it resonates today. So we're just going to have a brief conversation today, and I'll ask you a few questions if you can explain it to the audience about the text and how it came to be. So our first question, can you tell us about the genesis of the story and the personal journey that led to the writing of the book?
I would love to do that for you. So I want to start by saying I had no idea a few years ago that I even had this story in me, that I had the capacity to write an epic historical novel, which apparently that's what it's defined as. And so my publisher, some of you might know that I wrote a novel called Barbed Wire and Cherry Blossoms, and that was about World War II and the Cowra breakout. And I said back then, if I didn't write anything else ever, I would be happy that that was my last book. But my publisher sat me down and said, we'd like you to write, a period piece, an epic historical novel set in, the 19th century, and a women's story about Black and white women living on the land. And that was it. That's all I had as a brief. And I had no idea what I would do. Now, that was in May of 2017. What happened in June of 2017 was on the 165th anniversary of the Great Flood of Gundagai, in the main street of Gundagai on Sheridan Street, the town unveiled statues honouring Yarri and Jackie, who were the two Wiradjuri heroes of the Gundagai flood. Now, I wasn't in Gundagai at the time. I watched it all unfold on social media and in the media proper. And I thought to myself, how is it that all of Australia does not know about these two heroes who, over the course of 3 days, the Great Flood of Gundagai actually took the lives of a third of the town, which is around 80 people. And it's known as the greatest natural disaster in our history. So first of all, how is it we don't all know about this natural disaster? Because most people have heard of the dog on the tucker box at Gundagai. But put in the chat room, in the Q&A, if you haven't heard of that. And also, I did mean to say earlier, I see there's quite a few people online now. Could you put in the Q&A where you're actually zooming in from tonight, whose country you're on? Because it's interesting to know. We're all lifelong learners. If you don't know whose land you're on, just put whatever suburb or town you're in and ask the question, because somebody else might know the answer. So this is all about learning. We're all learning. So I'm watching all this unfold. I didn't know the complete story of the Great Flood, but I knew I obviously had heard of Yarri and Jackie. So what happened was, when I was watching all this unfold, and I'm thinking to myself, every Australian child should be learning about these heroes, I decided that the story would start with the Great Flood, that I would talk about the way in which before the local Wiradjuri people were moved into Brungle out of Gundagai and so forth, that they lived on the land, that they had warned the local people not to build in the floodplains, that it had flooded before, that it would flood again and so forth, that I could show through the opening of the story, the knowledge that local Wiradjuri people had of land. And then, so that was in June. So I had a beginning, but I didn't know where it was going to go. And then 6 months later, in the January of 2018, January 26 actually, I flew into Wagga to begin my journey of learning my language at the age of, I turned 50 that year. And I turned up at Charles Sturt University, which is the only university of its kind in the country doing anything like this, to start learning language. And then over the course of those 2 years, much of the lesson happened in the classroom, but also out on country in the floodplains along the river and so forth. And I was learning about life of my ancestors. I was imagining what it was like, and everything started to unfold. I went back to Wagga about 8 times, and to Gundagai quite a number of times, and Brungle as well. And then I started to create characters based on the strength of women that I knew and the resilience of women and Wiradjuri people that I knew, and wove that into the story. I won't give too much away because I've got other questions. So that's basically where it started. Yeah.
Yes, the relationships of the women in the novel were a telling thing for me, and I think we'll go to that later in our discussion. The cover of the book we've also discussed in our preliminary discussions last week. It recognises totems, characters and themes all explored throughout the story. Can you elaborate on the significance of the cover design? You have some copies. I don't know if you can reach them behind you.
I have
one
mine here too.
Yeah. Mine has a few post-it notes in it for my salient passages. I started weeping at page 80. I don't think I stopped. And that is actually after the Great Flood. So
Right.
I found the recognition ceremony after the flood was so moving. And it just spoke. I'm still affected by it. So I'll let you talk about the cover design because I think there's a lot to unpack there. It's very subtle, and I was going to ask you a question about the stars, but then I realised there's actually faint stars up the top, the galaxy. So please speak about your book cover.
Thank you for sharing your reaction to a certain part in the novel, because what happens is we all read differently, and somebody else logged in this evening might read that same page and not have the same reaction as you. And as a writer, like we have to understand that we have no control over the way people, read our work. So you're the first person I've heard say that they had that reaction to that particular scene. There are a number of scenes in the novel that are gut-wrenching and heartbreaking that I cried about when I wrote. But that wasn't one of them. So it's interesting. But as for so thank you for sharing that. Now, in terms of the cover, there's so many extraordinary things about this. I love this cover more than any other book that I have. And it partly because, or largely because, first of all, the title, Bila Yarrudhanggalangdhuray, it's the first time in Australian publishing history that they've had no English on the front cover of an Australian novel, and it's only been First Nations language. So we've really pushed the boundaries there and asked in a gentle way our booksellers and our sales reps and our readers and our libraries and so forth to get on board and just have a crack. Of course, if you can't say it, there's River of Dreams on the back. But just so people know, Bila is a Wiradjuri word that means river. Yarrudhang is the word for dream. Galang is the plural. So if I say Georgina's a yinna, that means she's a woman. If I talk about us being women, I would say yinna galang. So that galang is the plural, that's many dreams. And dhuray is the action of having the dreams. So it's the river of dreams. So that in itself is quite extraordinary to have a publisher agree. Well, it was partly their idea that we would do that. The goanna is the totem for many Wiradjuri people, particularly around Wagga. And so my cousin, Lukey Penrith, who lives in Brungle, where some of the novel is set, he gifted me that beautiful gugar, which is the Wiradjuri word for goanna. The white cockatoo is, when I was in Wagga, I'm a city girl. I was born and bred in Matraville, wrote my books in the Bowen Library. I tell people it's the perfect setting for creative inspiration. I booked that fishbowl for 2 hours at a time. There was a coffee cart.
Thank you for the plug.
There was a coffee cart in those days, and I couldn't believe. I go, oh my goodness, you can take your raisin toast and your coffee in the library. It was quite extraordinary. And so, so I go to Wagga. I'm in Wagga to learn my language, and I'm staying in a caravan park on the river. And at dusk, I hadn't seen this before, right? So at dusk, cockatoos just swarm and make this extraordinary, okay, there's probably a better word from this. People can put it in the Q&A, racket. So if you know the sound that the cockatoos make when they're en masse at dusk, please put it in the Q&A. So I come out and I video this. I've never seen anything like it or heard anything like it in my life. And I wrote a story for the Qantas magazine, and I wrote about this noise. And the editor said to me, I think you're being a bit dramatic. I said, I'm going to send you the video that I took, right? Because for a city person, it was quite extraordinary. So I think this is actual photo of the Murrumbidgee, and the white cockatoo really for me is for the memory of a dear friend of mine who was also a writer, Wiradjuri poet and activist, Kerry Reid Gilbert, who passed away in 2019. So that was her totem. And I used the names of some of her grandchildren who have Wiradjuri names as characters in the novel, with permission of Kerry's daughters as well. So the cover for me, I think they say you can't judge a book by its cover, but I absolutely believe that the cover should represent the story and the intent of the story and so forth. And I'd be interested to know if people wanted to put in the Q&A a cover of a novel that they've read that actually captured the story as well. So thank you for asking me that question, Georgina, because I'm very passionate about that.
I think the cover is so true to the story and the intent of the story and the tradition of the peoples in the story. I actually thought too that the Wagadine's mother, the totem was her totem as well. And when she arrives at Wagga, she experiences that cacophony that you have described, obviously, and it just grated with me that James was out to have a culling incident as soon as he got there. So it just speaks to the different attitude to land and culture and everything.
Right.
So
and thank you. Cacophony is the word that we were looking for. Thank you.
I couldn't understand why he found it so grating, but I think he thought his English Rose Louisa was going to be offended by it, so he had to eliminate them. But I don't find it offensive, but no. We'll move on because we have a lot to get through this evening. The Wiradjuri language is generously interspersed in the narrative. Can you share with us the significance of the use of your own language in this story, and what efforts have been made to reclaim the Wiradjuri language recently? If you could speak to those questions.
I would love to speak to that. It's interesting, Georgina, because it's only in the last few weeks that I've been thinking about Wiradjuri language and vocab in terms of my capacity to write the great Australian novel. I'm sure there's people logged in tonight that want to write the great Australian novel. And I'd always thought to myself, I have a very small vocab in terms of English. I have a smaller Wiradjuri vocab, but I have a very small vocab in terms of English. And I thought to myself, I've always been worried about I didn't have a big vocab. I think what I was missing was the Wiradjuri vocab in terms of being able to write the story that I wanted to write. So enrolling in the graduate certificate of Wiradjuri language, heritage and culture at Charles Sturt University changed my life in so many ways. It empowered me more. It gave me a greater sense of sovereignty as a Wiradjuri, but it actually made my storytelling more valuable to me, to the people I write for, to my, for my readers, to my family, to the people I write about. And I think I've always talked about First Nations literature being cultural products as opposed to just being books. So I think for me, I'm really grateful that Charles Sturt University runs this grad cert. I'm on my L plates. I know probably, 1/1,000,000th of what I need to know. There's an entire different grammar system. Uncle Stan Grant and Dr. John Rudder, who passed away recently, had documented the various material that have been created by a number of different linguists. So there's like 8 or 12 different words related to women. There's a number of different words for cockatoo. So there's, depends on which linguist you want to use when you're writing. So the language for me was about also wanting to show what Wiradjuri people and First Nations people the country over were forced to let go of, or what should I say, was robbed from them because they were forced to learn English in order to survive and interact and so forth. And interestingly, I read a comment on Audible this evening when I was preparing for tonight, looking at some of the reviews, and one of the reviews commented that they loved the story, but they didn't like the audio of it because the actor, Tamala Shelton, who's brilliant and does the language brilliantly, was speaking in a very fluent English an Australian accent, but in English. But that's what happens when you're acting in, we have actors do it. I mean, exactly how she should have done it. So you can't please everybody all of the time. But by the same token, nearly every other review speaks to being able to hear the language come alive. And I think for me, I can't imagine writing another book now that doesn't have my language in there. And as I say, I'm not fluent. Stringing sentences together is difficult. But what I want to do is I want readers to understand that everywhere they walk in Australia, there is a first language, and it's not English. And we're so conditioned to believe that English is the first language in this country, and it's not. The point of first contact, there were 800 different dialects, born out of 250 different language groups. And I think what the language maintenance and reclamation that's going on now through literature, Tara June Lynch's The Yield, Song of the Crocodile by Nadia Simpson, and so forth, and many others. I think that now we are, as readers of Australian literature, we are going to be so privileged now to be in the future picking up novels and children's books. And I've read a fantastic collection of poetry by Jazz Money on the weekend called How to Make a Basket. And much of that poetry has Wiradjuri language woven through it. I have no idea if I answered your question at all, Georgina.
Yes, you have. And I think the naming of Wogadine herself encapsulates the struggle with language, and she's repeatedly, consistently called Wilma by the men, and I think that's also a power issue as well. But there's so much to discuss with the dispossession of language in your novel, and it's heartening to hear that you're going to continue to integrate your language in your writing, which I think is fantastic, and it's an education to us all. So we look forward to the next novel in that respect. The next question is, the river flows through the landscape looming large, just as it is a powerful force in the story. It is life-affirming, but also soul-destroying. Can we talk more about the Bila and its central place in the story?
Of course. For those who don't know, Wiradjuri peoples are known as the people of the three rivers. So there's the Murrumbidgee Bila, the Murrumbidgee River. There's the Galari or the Kalari, which is the Lachlan River. And then there's the Womble, which is the Macquarie River. So rivers for all Wiradjuri mob are significant places of history and culture and heritage. And for me, the Bila in this story is a character because it's so much a part of Wiradjuri people at the time, and even now today, obviously for sustenance. We have very significant cultural scenes by the river when Wogadine and Yinjamara have children, when Wogadine's birthing.
Yes.
But as you mentioned, we know the river is incredibly powerful. It can break dreams as much as they can make them, or help fulfill dreams. I spent a lot of time at the river, as I say, sitting by the river, running by the river when I'm there, standing in the river. At one point in November 2018, a group of about 20 of us did a tribute row for Yarri and Jackie from Gundagai, 20 kilometres downriver towards Wagga. And for me, because I'm a method writer, I wanted to be on the water to try and understand the enormity of the force of this natural landscape. I wanted to see what the shoreline and the landscape looked like from the water. Now, having said that, it was a beautiful November day, like, I don't know, maybe late 20s, stunning sky, not a cloud in the sky. There's 20 of us. I'm wearing a life jacket. I did fall in, which I didn't like because I'm competitive, which is not a Wiradjuri value at all. And I didn't want to be the one that fell in. But what was good about falling in is it gave me the sense, a tiny sense of fear, because I also needed to imagine the fear of all the people who were stuck in the flood, clinging to trees, sitting on roofs and so forth. And and also what I got from being on the river and trying to maneuver in much simpler conditions than in torrential rain and raging floodwaters was how skillful and knowledgeable those men were to be able over 3 days to take their bark canoes out and fight against currents and storms, one person at a time. And it's believed that Yarri saved the lives of 49 people and Jackie 20. So I just can't even imagine how they managed to do that in those conditions. So for me, I wanted to understand the power of the river. I wanted to understand also the skill that it would take to make that happen. And I think that when I'm down there, or when I was researching this book, and I stood in the floodplains of Wagga Wagga as well, because Wagga was also a place that flooded. And I tried to imagine how my ancestors survived during times of natural disasters, but also how they survived the disaster of colonization on their land and to them as human beings. So, and we know towards the end, I don't want to give spoilers away, so I won't say anything else.
Yeah, I'm not going to give the ending, but I found some of the passages around the river and the women's business and the birthing very soothing passages, but then the dichotomy with the torrential storm at the beginning and other events later in the book, but their passage along the river as well, and also Yindi taking his sons out, teaching him bushcraft knowledge, traditional knowledge. They were just the most intimate passages in the book. And as you say, everyone needs to know this information because it helps inform you and nourish you as well. So I just found that the difference in the tempest of the river and the soothing nature of the river and the life-giving events around the river were just such a contrast, and it was hard. One of the sons was named after the river that he was birthed in as well. So Galari, I think that was quite a powerful naming, and the water dragon was the other son. I will let you pronounce that word because I haven't looked it up.
I can't even remember it off the top of my head.
Narang, I think, but N-G-A.
Narin? Is it Narin?
Yep, Narin. Probably
I have to
pronounced
have a look
that
at
way.
the glossary in the back because I can't even remember.
Yes,
sorry.
The great glossary in the back. It's fantastic, and the app. So you learn something every day in this job. So it's just a marvelous narrative. So
Narang. Yep, water dragon.
Yep. So we'll move on to the next question. Spirituality is also a powerful theme in your narrative. Can we talk about the different belief systems? Do you think that Louisa realises the failings of her own belief system by the end, and the strengths of the Wiradjuri spiritual belief system? Particularly the connection to family, country and language, especially when she sees Wagadine's life choices and her happiness in those choices that she makes.
Great questions there. I'll have a crack at answering most of them. It's interesting because I had these two characters. I had Wagadine. Obviously, Wagga, for people who don't know, Wagadine means dancer. The town of Wagga Wagga, for many years, people believed it was the place of many crows because the word crow is wagon. So that mistake could be easily made. But Wagga means dance. So Wagga Wagga means, place of celebration and dance. So Wagga City Council have only had to change all their collateral around that in recent years. So that was something I learned when I was, yes. And so what happens, I have these two women and I'm talking about the relationship between, the settler woman and Wagadine. And then someone said to me, you should make Louisa a Quaker. I raced home that night. I was Googling Quakers. And of course I learned that the Quakers came out to Australia in 1832. And their main two missions here were the equality of Aboriginal people or as they would say, Aborigines, and convicts. the rights of convicts. And I thought, this is perfect to have this character who wants to do the right thing and make change and into social justice and so forth. Now, I understand that the principles, my understanding was the principles of Quakerism were integrity, equality, simplicity, community, and stewardship of the earth. And that Quakers believe in that God is present in everyone. Now, Wiradjuri values and beliefs centre around kinship, as you mentioned, and family, respect, or yinjimara, my favourite Wiradjuri word, caring for each other. And the Wiradjuri people of Gundagai and Brungle, where obviously the story is set around much of, lived in harmony with the land and plants and animals and the river. We don't believe that we own the land, but we belong the land. We don't own the land, we belong to the land, and therefore we have a responsibility of looking after it, and that we have a creator spirit known as Bayami. So we read in the novel when Louisa meets the old women by the river that there are some similarities in terms of the values or the structure or the belief systems in people and equality and so forth and so on. But I think, and when we see also earlier in the novel, when Wargadine sees David praying during the flood, and she thinks she's trying to understand that, maybe he has a God that he prays to as well, because she's also asking Bayami just to, keep them alive and so forth. So there's these moments of recognition where there is a similarity in a belief system of some sort. There is someone that we are praying to. Of course, we see Wargadine go to church and can't understand anything that the priest is saying and thinks none of it makes sense whatsoever. So there's a little bit of humor in the novel. I think the differences between Louisa, the stark difference is family, is what I see, because obviously being removed from her family is what tears at Wargadine's heart every day that she's away. And her decline and her rapid decline into it, after the children and so forth, into depression because she just wants to go home. Whereas Louisa, and she tells Louisa about her family, and she meets all the women and everybody's an auntie and so forth. Louisa can't believe her family is so big. And Louisa never speaks of her family. Yes, her mother and father and brothers and her husband died in the flood, but then there's no conversation about family back in England. And for me, this is something that I notice, that we Aboriginal people, we're claiming our cousins all the time. And we don't talk about a first or second cousin. We're family, kinship way. And I think so that's a stark difference. And that is what makes it difficult for Louisa to understand why Wargadine is so desperate to get home, because they don't have the same sense of family and the same sense of belonging to place. Given that her family chose to come out to Australia, they made a choice. And Wargadine's like, why would you choose to move away from where you come from where you belong? So I think there's some stark differences in their understanding of place and family. I do think, what I wanted to portray with Louisa's not a bad person. I've had
she isn't.
No, she's not a bad person. It was a hard life for women generally. For settler women, there was a lot of abuse and so forth. Obviously, they can't be compared because, Aboriginal people were denied access to everything we had rights to. So, moved off land, forced not to speak language, children eventually removed under acts of protection and so forth, living under a Masters and Servants Act and so forth, a whole lot of legislation. But, I wasn't trying to portray Louisa as the enemy here, but I did want to portray a woman who had the power, who had in her heart wanted to do good things. One, it never translated into the action that she wanted it to, and two, the doing the good things was always going to be on her terms. So yes, she wanted to find equality and help Aboriginal people, Wiradjuri people, but she had the power to let Wargadine go long before she did. So it was like, I'm going to do this, but it's going to be on my terms. I do believe that she realises towards the end her failings for herself, for what she wanted to achieve under her Quaker values and what she wanted to achieve for her friend who she genuinely cared for Wargadine, but she invested all her needs into Waggadine being able to, into Waggadine, where Waggadine didn't need Louisa for anything. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It's perfectly true. And I think one of the sequences where you show your local history research in Wagga, the opening of the School of Arts in 1859, and Louisa goes there just about every day doing research to try and support her mission in life. I think towards the end, as you say, she realises that she hasn't achieved what she wanted to. And I think the position that she found herself in with the abusive husband who was drinking excessively, but to the public was that became the mayor of Wagga, an upstanding citizen. This sort of the lie that she was living, really, she came to realise that she wasn't going to achieve what she'd hoped to by moving to Wagga and marrying James. So, but I agree with you. She could have let Waggadine go a long time before she did. So that was the tragedy of that relationship. But she isn't a bad person at all. So this sort of segues nicely into our next question, which we may have already answered, I think, because of so many of the different power relationships in the novel. I really wanted to focus on the relationships between women, both intercultural relationships and within the Wiradjuri nation. So relationships between women loom large. Can we discuss the friendship between Waggadine and Louisa, which we already have done, and how is this different to Waggadine's relationships with her mother, the aunties, and her daughter, and why are their experiences of marriage so different?
Okay. If we look at the relationships there, so we know that the relationship between Waggadine and Louisa is not an equal relationship. So Louisa comes into the story as the love interest and then wife of David Bradley, who Waggadine is a servant for. So it's unequal, even though Louisa from day one gives Waggadine the respect that she deserves, calls her by her name, invites her to sit and drink, all the things she's never experienced, is outraged when she learns that Waggadine is living in a room off the kitchen without a window, and treats her in a way that leaves Waggadine suspicious, I guess you'd say, because she's never experienced this before. So, but it's not, they're not on an equal footing, because, you know, Waggadine's still living under the Masters and Servants Act. And that's a relationship between an employer and two, someone who is a very new friend who you're also suspicious of, is never going to be the same as a relationship between a mother and a daughter and an aunts and so forth. And in their family group, in our family groups, everybody has a role to play. So, ceremony can't happen if everybody who has to sing is not there, if the women aren't there to dance, if the men aren't there to play the didge or whatever, they're not, everybody has a purpose and a role, and it is an egalitarian space to be in. So I think what we see through ceremony, through the farewells, when we see Waggadine's farewell, we see the smoking, we see the dancing, what we see with the women that Waggadine meets when she goes to Wagga and they go to the camp, and the fun side of welcoming Louisa and Waggadine into that group, and they're weaving, and they get down and they quack like ducks and so forth, that sort of thing. What we see there is community and belonging and togetherness and a very generous spirit that I don't think we saw through any aspect of Louisa's. Well, no, that's not true. We do see her being kind and generous to Waggadine. We do see later on that she's got new servants working for her, and they're all dressed differently. So we know Waggadine knows that she's got good things, but she's still got servants, the thing that she never ever wanted to have. So I think there's still a power imbalance there. So that you don't see between family members, even if it's mother and daughter. It's the respect of a daughter to her mother, for the wisdom and the love and the unconditional love and the caring, and that then Wargadine has for her own children. And I don't think there's a comparison for the relationships.
No, but I just, the tenderness of the marriage between Wargadine and Yindi contrasts markedly with the marriage.
If we talk about those relationships, so if we look at, I wrote about a male character based on all the Black men that I know, who are loving and generous and kind and respectful and want to make their women safe and happy and so forth. And I think all the men in my world are like Yindi. I don't know why I'm not married to one, honestly, but come to think of it, they're all like that because I'm related to most of them. So the difference is, so what we see is, we see David Bradley and Louisa Spencer. Both have lost their families. She has nobody. They literally, yes, there's chemistry, they fall in love, but they clung to each other in times of grief, right? And then Wargadine, who's never experienced love before, she's never known love, romantic love, and see that conversation, which is the conversation that girlfriends have about.
It is,
So but she'd never had that conversation before. So what we see there is this absolutely beautiful, naive, innocent. Well, it's naive and innocent as it can be for any man who's, naked in the water of the river with a woman nearby. So I tried to, but I wanted that naivety. I wanted it to be pure, and I wanted it to be a love that was unconditional and lasting and born from a connection of family and understanding country and language and so forth. And I feel like I wrote that scene in the river when they met and so forth. It's one of the first scenes I wrote. I'm a plotter, so I map out the entire book before I start writing. So I knew that was going to happen. So I wrote that in a cafe somewhere in Barcelona, waiting to meet the love of my life sometime. Never happened. Anyway, and so I feel like their story is probably the most important story there. I mean, the story of the landscape, that's important, the flood's important, but what we see play out between Yinjimarra and Wargadine brings it all home in terms of country, in terms of culture, in terms of family, in terms of resilience, because what we see right to the end of that novel is their resilience.
Yes, the struggle to go on without spoiling it at the end just highlights the tenderness of the relationship and their absolute passion for each other. And that was born of a connection with language. They realised they were Wiradjuri because of the words that were spoken. And I just found that so powerful, that they found their way, through a connection of that nature. So I just, again, please keep on using the language in your work. So our next question, the themes explored in the book concerning the treatment of First Nations people all resonate in Australian society today. What do you hope that contemporary readers can learn from your narrative?
Thank you. I firmly believe that when we understand our past, we better understand our present. And Australia is still, I think, coming to terms with the realities of Aboriginal experience throughout history and how that plays out today. The way we grieve for being off country, the issues around having pride in identity, when you may not even know your family because of policies of removal, because you were forced off traditional lands, or maybe your ancestors were born from violence or abuse in your family history at the hands of white settlers. And all that impacts on who we are as individuals, but who we are as a community and a nation. I hope readers take away a greater respect for the role that Aboriginal people, First Nations people play in working the land, a greater understanding of what country means to us. And although we've been forced to become resilient over decades of facing adversity, that we remain a proud people. There's a couple of things also. When the novel came out, or not just when the novel came out, in the middle of last year, we had an international movement known as the Black Lives Matter movement. And it took the very public, disgusting murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis for Australians to actually come to understand that that's been happening here for 3 decades. We've had a Black Lives Matter movement since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody in the early 90s. And around that time, around the world, there was a lot of tearing down of statues of known racists throughout history. So I'm hoping that my novel and the unveiling of the statue of Yardie and Jackie also contributes to the conversation around the lack of statues that recognise our warriors and our leaders, as opposed to the enormous number of statues that celebrate particularly colonisers and colonial events that do not necessarily tell the full story, that do not include First Nations people and our role in the shared history of this country. I also hope that when people read about the heroism of Yardie and Jackie, and there were 2 other men, Long Jimmy and Tommy Davis, who went out on into the flood as well, but didn't save people. But there were 4 men that risked their lives. That people start to actually come to understand the knowledge that First Nations people have of land and waters.
Yes.
Only in recent times, since those devastating bushfires, have First Nations people, including my mob down in Brungle and Gundagai and so forth, in terms of cultural burns. That's only being recognised en masse now, that we've done cultural burns for tens of thousands of years, and this is how you prevent bushfires. So I'm hoping that conversations occur around land and land use and Indigenous knowledge systems in that space as well.
Yes, I agree with you totally about knowledge, and that was played out, as we've already discussed, in Yindi taking his sons out to start teaching him how to survive in the bush and how to manage the land and how to build canoes, etc., but also how to have respect for the land as well, I think is one of the takeaways from the story as well. I believe that your publishing house may have a second book in the pipeline for you. Is that correct?
Actually, we're going to do when we're in Gundagai. So we launched in Gundagai Tumut, which is one of my elders launched them out there. It was wonderful. I mean, my greatest concern was not whether I got good literary reviews. It was that the people of Gundagai, who, descendants of people who either died or survived the floods, were happy, that my elders were happy, that Wiradjuri people and language speakers were happy. What we had conversations about what needed to be next. And one of the conversations was that we needed the story of the Great Flood, and our heroes needed to be told. Our kids in schools needed to hear about that. So we're doing a kids picture book called The Great Flood.
Yes.
So I've got to get that story in by the end of October. And I've got going to do a novel, Dirayawada, means to rise up. Dirayawada means to rise up. That's a Wiradjuri command, and it'll start with the Battle of Bathurst and Wiradjuri as another Wiradjuri hero, because we often we hear about wars being declared, and the invasion of Australia was never phrased as a war, but I believe it was the greatest undeclared war in history. When you've got warfare and introduced disease and you're encroaching on other people's lands, that's invasion, and invading another country is a declaration of war. So I'm going to do another another epic historical novel, but I want it to go over 100 years, and because I would like to look at also the some other legends and heroes that move into the early 20th century. So I'm just mapping that out now. I won't start work on that till next year. Yeah, but I'm very excited about that. And that again will, I'll have a lot of language in there, hopefully.
Yes, I was excited to hear about another Wiradjuri hero is going to be documented in another novel, so we'll look forward to that. How has Bila been received by the critics?
Well, my critics, are just normal readers. My critics are the people that have logged in tonight. I don't write for awards. I don't write, we all want a nice review. Every writer I know gets upset if a reviewer doesn't review their work well, because quite often I find if a reviewer is critical, even of people I read, it's because they don't understand the story. And no one's going to say this didn't speak to me. But I had a quick look this evening before I got online to have what was going on. So I was really pleased to see that there were over 500 ratings on Goodreads and 119 reviews. And if you ever want to support an author, the best thing you can do is just write a review on Goodreads. I had a quick look at the Audible, which I mentioned, which was narrated by Tamala Shelton. It was incredibly popular. Many have told me that they've read and listened to the book because they liked the sound of listening to the language. Overwhelmed by the positive literary reviews and journal articles. So I didn't even factor those into my anxiety, which I had for 2 months until the day I had my first event at the Sydney Writers Festival, just before everybody went back into lockdown. I was sick for 24/7 for about 2 months. I had blood tests. I couldn't sleep. I was nauseous the whole time. Turns out it was anxiety about the book. And so once I'd had my first event with Tony Birch at the Sydney Writers Festival, and I had a little launch in Sydney for my family. And then once I got out to Gundagai the next week, I launched it here in Brisbane, went out to Gundagai, and Auntie Sony Piper, who's the matriarch of Brungle, she did a beautiful launch there with Miriam Crane, who, she hates me saying this, but Miriam is the font of all knowledge in Gundagai. She knows so much history. There's a steering committee, a Yardie and Jackie steering committee, who put together the proposal for the statue. But also, I didn't mention, in 2019, the two men were, the committee was presented with posthumous heroism awards for Yardie and Jackie. So if my elders are happy with the story, Uncle Stan Grant loved it. It really is a tribute to him and what he's done for our people in recording and teaching the language. He's now got proteges that teach, because he's been well for a couple of years now. I had aunties in Tumut who, when they launched, it was interesting. They spoke about their lives growing up around Brungle and Tumut, and how the story, although set in the 19th century, was very, resonated with their lives and so forth. So I'm really happy. I'm happy that it has been received the way that it was intended, that it was from my heart to everybody else's heart.
I think the First Nations people who've written some glowing reviews are testament to how it has impacted your people, but also the wider community as well. And I think you're being a little bit modest, because I read a lot of reviews on the backs of books, being a librarian, and you can tell when it's marketing spin and when it's from the heart. And I think this book came from the heart, and everyone who reads it is deeply affected by it.